A lot of the questions that I was considering were at the intersection of so many of my interests and so many of the different fields I'd been straddling in American studies, but also in history.
Every year, the Fulbright Prize in American Studies is awarded to one or two individuals as part of a competition managed by the Austrian Association for American Studies, and the winner receives a cash prize financed by Fulbright Austria. This year, the award went to Eleanor Tarla for her master's thesis, entitled Preparedness, Defense, Success: The Imagination of Survival in Contemporary U.S.-American Survivalist Manuals. Following the award ceremony, we sat down with Eleanor to gain more insights into her research.
So in my MA thesis, I focused on 4 contemporary US-American survivalist manuals and examined what I call the imagination of survival, focusing on the way in which survival is imagined and equated with preparedness, defense, and success in these manuals. And so what I tried to do in my thesis is to actually contextualize these manuals and the ideas they have about survival within a larger US kind of context, to discuss the historical continuities, to examine the way in which the frontier rhetoric, the Cold War, kind of play into the way survival has been imagined. I think it felt quite unexpected to me. I just stumbled upon survivalist literature, wasn't even manuals at the time. And I had a lot of questions about it, and then I kind of couldn't find a single academic text about it. And it felt like a lot of the questions that I was considering were at the intersection of so many of my interests and so many of the different fields I'd been straddling in American studies, but also in history. And so I think it just, a lot of different interests coalesced, and a lot of questions I'd been asking myself in other fields, in feminist theory, in American studies, in history, they all seem to kind of play a role in that topic also. So it was came at the right time for me. When I tried to kind of approach what I call the imagination of survival in these texts, but also beyond the 4 manuals I looked at, I started to kind of distinguish between 3 different fields and discourses that I would say are absolutely interconnected, but that you can also view distinctly. And I examined the way in which survival is understood as preparedness. Then I looked at survival as kind of defense, so the way in which survival is imagined as something military and defensive, where you protect yourself from an outside force. The third aspect of survival that I started noticing is that survival was often equated with success, or they seemed to be almost synonyms of each other. And that had many different layers. There was this aspect of survival, that if one survived, one was successful, a winner in a kind of race with others. But then also the way in which survivalism itself was kind of equated with becoming successful in this very self-helpy way. So I tried to kind of distinguish between these different layers of what survival meant within these texts, because it's so ever-present, the idea that you need to survive something, this kind of scenario or the multiple scenarios that are being imagined. And the scenarios differ widely, but what they all share is this, are these different layers to survival. I mean, that's what I'm working on currently. I'm still kind of in this field. I'm looking at survival manuals, but also I'm kind of trying to look back, when did that kind of text start? And that would be probably sometime in the 19th century. You didn't call it a survival manual, but you have the same kind of information in there. So when did the notion of a survival manual or a survival guide, when did these words become conjoined? That's what I'm trying to look at. But then I'm also focusing more on the kind of self-help genre, because that's where you find most kind of survival guides nowadays. I stumble across a survival guide every week. My university will say a survival guide for new students. You know, you have MA courses called Survival 101, or PhD classes called Survival 101, how to survive your PhD. But then you also have like lots of different self-help books that call themselves survival manuals, but they're not actually about survival in the sense where you're not out in the woods. So what kind of survival are we talking about in these examples? So survival has become quite abstract also, right? It's about mentally surviving something, overcoming hardships, overcoming challenges is framed as an act of survival. And I think that's a really interesting moment in the evolution of the meaning of survival and the way it's expanded from physically surviving something, remaining alive, to overcoming different situations in which one has suffered or experienced trauma. I think there's some positives and some negatives. The positives being that people who have experienced some kind of trauma or hardship or disease, I mean, you have different categories of survivors, right? We speak of like the cancer survivor, for instance, or the rape survivor, sexual assault survivor. So there are different kinds of survivorship in public discourse, I think, that are very prominent. What is being offered is a way to speak of a very difficult experience in a way that kind of conveys and creates agency and a sense of empowerment and of having ownership over one's experience and the overcoming of pain and suffering. One of the difficulties of this kind of spread of the notion of survivorship is that sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between different kinds of survivors. So the category of survivor can allow different speakers to kind of obscure differences. You see that being critiqued in the context of war. Frequently, you can speak, for instance, of victims of war and of veterans as survivors within different war contexts. In the Vietnam War, a lot of veterans were referred to as survivors, but that category also encompasses victims of massacres, for instance. So the category can be applied to vastly different groups and individuals who acted in vastly different ways. But that difference is obscured. So questions of responsibility, questions of guilt can kind of be evaded or can kind of be obscured by the category of survivors. So it's a difficult category, I think, because it gives some people a language to frame their experiences that is positive and that is psychologically helpful. And on the other hand, sometimes it can also denigrate someone just because often a survivor is understood in opposition to a victim. So there's this notion that being a survivor is great because you were empowered and able to help yourself overcome something, whereas a victim is kind of denigrated because they have suffered and they're seen as maybe stuck in their suffering, or they're seen as less powerful, less able to enact change for themselves. So I think it can also lead to a kind of valuing of yeah, how people deal with experiences. I'm very honored to have been given the Fulbright Prize. I attended the Fulbright Seminar in American Studies in 2016, so a while ago. And it was at the beginning of my interest in American Studies. So it was a really wonderful opportunity at the time to get to know American Studies scholars, but also students from overseas. And it was a really lovely experience. So it was nice to kind of come full circle and to have my own interest in American Studies and my own kind of research be valued. Yeah.